For those of you joining us on Zoom, welcome to the March Great Talks, Great Books Talk. For those of you here in the collab, welcome back. It's been a long 2 years since we've managed to be here, and we are starting off with a great and timely lecture from Dr. Jim sounds weird, Dr. James McWard. Jim has been here for 26 years. He taught previously at KCK and was at GTA, a few other places, but we spotted him when he was young and we grabbed him and we haven't let go. He teaches Comp 1, Comp 2, and masterpieces of cinema. And in the past, he's taught technical writing, mass media and society, major British authors, as well as introduction to poetry. He has served in a variety of capacities. He recently was the chair for the English department. He has been the liaison for distance learning, mentor, and has also served through the Faculty Association and done some negotiating. He holds a bachelor's of English and journalism, as well as a master's from Mizzou down the road, and his PhD is from the University of Kansas. His dissertation focused on the relationship between published journal writing and fiction writing during the 17th and 18th centuries, which may come into play here.
Yes.
Okay. And he is an avid cyclist, to say the least, and he watches movies, which you would expect from somebody teaching the cinema course. He thought the discussion of the Journal of a Plague Year, and I'm quoting from him, would be interesting given the current pandemic. Journal of a Plague Year is not as well known or as influential as Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, but it's a book that does have spikes in popularity due to current events. For example, it was popular for study during the height of the AIDS epidemic, and with the current pandemic, you'll see it referenced in some news and opinion pieces discussing similarities and differences between the Great Plague of London and COVID could tell us a lot about human nature, both optimistically and pessimistically. So, optimistically, here's Dr. McWard.
Thank you very much for coming, and I want to thank the CoLab for opening this up for the first Great Books in person for a while. I know it involves some moving around, but I'm glad that we're in person as well as being on Zoom. And I want to thank you all for again being here. So this is actually the 300th anniversary of the Journal of the Plague Year. I didn't anticipate, I didn't even make that connection until after I'd chosen the book. But you know, we choose these books like a year in advance for this thing, and when I suggested Journal of the Plague Year, I was a little worried that we wouldn't want to revisit the pandemic since it would be in the rearview mirror, and we wouldn't want to be talking about something that was over and done with 6 months before my talk. It didn't occur to me that we would still be here wearing masks, you know, talking about it as it's still going on, since the original, the topic only lasted a year, you know, just 1665. Now in year 2 of ours, but like I said, it was published in 1722. Daniel Defoe was 5 years of age when the plague happened, so he is not he wasn't writing anything down when he was 5 years of age, doing any of this, okay? Why did he suddenly decide to publish this in 1722? It was because, one of the reasons was that they were anticipating another plague beginning. There was one going on over in France around 1719, 1720, something around that. And Defoe, as we'll learn, is always the entrepreneur, saw an opportunity here to get something out, and so that's why it came out in 1722. So here is the beginning of the book. These are the opening lines. So I want to read this, and then we'll talk about what's going on here. So it was about the beginning of September 1664 that I, among the rest of my neighbors, heard in ordinary discourse that the plague was returned again in Holland. Hence it was that this rumor died off again, and people began to forget it, and as a thing we were very little concerned in, and that we hoped was not true. To the latter end of November, or the beginning of December 1664, when 2 men, said to be Frenchmen, died of the plague in Longacre, or rather at the upper end of Drury Lane. 2 physicians and a surgeon were ordered to go to the house and make inspection, finding evident tokens of the sickness upon their bodies of the dead. Publicly that they died of the plague, and it was printed in the weekly bill of mortality in usual manner thus: Plague 2, parishes infected 1. And then for the next 200 pages, people die. Over and over and over again. This sets everything off. Now, this again is not when this was going on, so it's, you know, but it is accurate. You read other things from the time period. The plague did begin in Holland, and he argues about it coming from places besides Holland, but most immediately it was Holland before that. Some other things that are interesting here is that he's very specific about, like, he said that died of the plague in Longacre, or rather the upper end of Drury Lane. One thing that's very interesting about the plague year, the book, is that it all takes place in London for the most part, and you really get to know London by the time the thing is over. The plague went from the western part of London to the eastern part of London, and Defoe is very, very concerned about, like, the movement, and he mentions a lot of streets, a lot of parishes, all that kind of stuff throughout the whole thing, and you just get a taste of it here. So if you're not familiar with, like, London, that's somewhat of a cumbersome thing because you're trying to get this thing placed. In the book I have, there's all these footnotes explaining where that is in modern day London and things like that. And then at the end, Plague 2, parishes infected. One thing that he keeps doing throughout the whole thing is keeping, like, a mathematical tally of the number of people who were killed. And he goes by parish, okay? So wherever the churches were, they were the ones keeping track of the dead. But let's talk, so what we have here, so leaping ahead, ultimately what would happen is this plague would last a year. So the official count was like something like 70, 80,000 people died, something around, maybe a little under 80, I can't remember. But most historians, including our narrator of the book, believe the death toll was closer to 100,000. There were only 450,000 people in London at the time. So it's very close to almost 25% of people dying. So in our current pandemic, if you want to think, like, start making some comparisons, you know, we're approaching 1 million dead in the United States. We've had 6 million people globally die, so we're approaching 1 million. With 330 million people in the United States, that's not even hitting 1%, okay? But we have had about 80 million now people who have caught COVID, okay? So we can all think about the people, some of you have caught COVID, we all know people who have caught COVID. Now just imagine, if you want to put yourself back in what it was like in London in 1665, imagine all those people, including yourself, who had COVID if you had died. Because 80 million people, that's about 25% of the population of the United States. That gives you some indication, because when people say, oh, it's only 100,000 people, that doesn't sound like much. Well, 100,000 out of 450,000, that's a lot of people, that's a lot of the population of the city. And so on the one hand, we are much better off than they were in 1665, but we have a lot more people getting, in terms of the people getting the illness, we're like 25% like they were back then. It's just that we're not dying in the huge numbers that they did back in 1665. So some things up here too. He mentions this tokens at the end, finding evident tokens of sickness upon the body. So this is the bubonic plague. What would happen, this is not like an airborne virus like we have today, where we're wearing masks. Basically, you have to imagine the city of London was growing significantly. There were a lot of poor people in London that were living in very miserable conditions, packed into very small living spaces. And they did not have a very good sewage system in London. So you had a lot of filth, a lot of all this, and what does that attract? Rats. And the rats were everywhere. And once the rats were killed by this little, like, flea, the flea went and lashed onto people, okay? And so again, just like, they think that, like, COVID started from a bat, possibly, the plague that's going on here is rat-based, okay? So it's another example of transference from an animal to a human, okay? And it just went from people to people because the fleas would come off of one person onto another person, and they'd get a bite, you could survive it. What would happen is that your lymph nodes would like suddenly swell. So you can see swellings in the neck, in the groin, and like in the armpits, or that would happen. Okay, and that was a sign that you had the plague. Most people would then die, but you didn't have to die. Okay, I mean, some people made it. They would lance that swelling. The swelling would go down, and they'd be okay. But these tokens, once the tokens appeared, and he emphasizes this over and over again in the book, you were a goner, usually within a few hours. Okay, so the token was like a big bruise that would appear on your stomach, on your leg, somewhere like that, and that was kind of a sign that you're in your last hours of your life. And that was also a sign for sure that they died of a plague, not something else. Okay, when they inspected the body, they looked for those, what they call tokens, on there. So before we get back into the book, let's talk about Daniel Defoe. There he is. That's not his real hair. That's a wig. Wigs were very popular in the 17th and 18th century. It's a bald man's paradise. I was born 300 years too late. But you know, he is not like your typical author. He had a bunch of different occupations. So first off, he's a dissenter. Now, what that meant, his family was dissenters too. He came from a family of dissenters. So these are people who are not associated with the official Church of England. So you had, during this time, you had your Catholics, your Church of England, or your Anglicans, and then the dissenters. And the dissenters would have been like your Baptists, your Presbyterians, your Quakers. His family was pretty much Presbyterian, okay? And being a dissenter meant you were kind of not accepted fully into society. Like you couldn't become like a politician and serve in Parliament or something like that. He couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. He went to a dissenting academy, okay? So there were things that were kind of excluded, and a lot of his writings were about being a dissenter. And then he was also a businessman. That was the main thing he did. He did everything from like running a brick factory to dealing with clothes to importing, exporting wine. Wherever he could make a dollar, he was trying to do that. He was a prisoner. He had problems with debt as a businessman, and he was usually getting thrown into prison for the debtor's prison. And that's one thing he wrote about. He thought that was very unfair. And it makes sense because how are you going to pay that person back if you're sitting in prison? So a lot of his like pieces of writing had to do with changing this law about putting in debtor's prison and things like that. I'll talk about him just a second there with, well, I'll go ahead and talk about that now since it relates to the prisoner. So he was involved in like debtor's prison for a few times. Sometimes he'd try to go into hiding, like get away from somebody he owed money to. The most serious thing that happened to him is he wrote a pamphlet called The Shortest Way with Dissenters. And it was kind of like Jonathan Swift wrote something called A Modest Proposal, and in which he argued that the way to solve the problems in Ireland is just to eat the babies, basically. And of course, he wasn't being serious. I mean, but he said that's what the British should be doing. The Irish should just be having babies and like it'd be like cattle, And he was being overly ironic, overly sarcastic. So Defoe's trying to do the same thing with dissenting. He's like, here's what we should do with dissenters, and he tells all these bad things about what you should do, and he's pretending to be like part of the Anglican Church, okay? Well, they thought this was sedition, and a lot of people thought it was literal, like he meant it, and whenever he got in trouble, he would say, I'm just being ironic. But this has some serious repercussions. So he was on the run for a while after this one in hiding, and they finally caught him. Took him into jail. He could have gotten killed for this because the Queen even got upset with some of what he had said because they thought it made her look bad. What they did, he was in prison for a while, and then they said, we'll do 3 days in the pillory. And he had to do 3 different, and they moved this pillory. This is the pillory there, he's got his hands in there, and this is a 19th century painting, so it was done afterward. But what you would do, he had 3 days, so they moved it from one location to the other so everybody in London could see this guy, being embarrassed like this, and he had to stand an hour each time. Now that doesn't look like it's too bad, but this could be a deadly thing. You were allowed to do anything you wanted to the people in the pillory. So people would, of course, throw fruit at them, is the thing that we see like in movies sometimes. You could throw feces at them if you wanted to. You could also throw rocks. And that was very dangerous. Sometimes people got hit like in the head and got seriously injured in the pillory. Fortunately for Defoe, he had a lot of friends. And you see this picture, like they're like keeping people away, and people are bringing flowers to him and stuff like that. they think it wasn't quite that, like people weren't bringing flowers, but he had enough friends that they kept people from throwing rocks and things like that. And in fact, what they were doing instead, they turned it into a commercial enterprise. They actually sold some of his pamphlets and things at his own pillory, including The Shortest Way with Dissenters, okay, which is why he was in the pillory. They were selling these things as they were up there, and he still was supposed to stay in prison for a while afterwards. He got out of prison, and he wasn't supposed to write, I think, for the next 7 years, and he completely ignored that. He started writing immediately. And then he also was a spy for the British government during this time. Scotland was not yet part of Great, you had just England and Scotland was up here. And during Defoe's lifetime, the two joined together to eventually form Great Britain. And so the government hired him as a spy to go into Scotland, hang out in taverns, meet with people, and then he'd write correspondence about how people in Scotland felt about joining up with England and forming a country, okay? And mostly, though, he was a writer. He wrote, we don't know how much he wrote because he never signed anything. But some people think it was anywhere between, like, he had 250 to like over 300 published pieces. And he wrote everything from pamphlets to books, not just novels, but also books on how to run the government well and all that kind of stuff. He had his own newspaper that was, called The Review. He published things in that all the time about politics and stuff like that. So he was quite the active writer. These are his novels. Now, let me just go back up here. See, he died in 1731, born in 1660. So you see that his first novel was Robinson Crusoe. He went quite a bit of his life before he got into this novel writing business. And novels, of course, were just kind of becoming a thing. And some people consider Robinson Crusoe to be the first novel ever written. That's kind of overly simplistic. There's all these definitions about what a true novel is. Aphra Behn wrote Oroonoko back in the 17th century. Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan was written in the 17th century. Some people say that's not Pilgrim's Progress is not a novel because it's too didactic. It's more of an allegory or something. So the best thing we do, like when I wrote my dissertation on all this stuff, I did not use the term novel too much. I used prose fiction. And so any of this like early stuff in the 17th, 18th century, you don't call it a novel, you kind of call it prose fiction. But if you want to think of these, and even like Journal of the Plague Year, it's really kind of hard to call that a novel. Some people call it a pseudo-history, historical fiction, things like that. A lot of people thought it was completely factual when it came out, and I'll show you that in just a second. But you see how fast he can write. So Robinson Crusoe was published in 1719. It went through like 4 editions, 4 printings immediately. In August of that same year, he published The Farther Adventures of Robinson Crusoe to capitalize on that. And then Memoirs of Cavalier, Captain Singleton is about a pirate. And then 1722 was a big year. He published Moll Flanders, Journal of the Plague Year, and Colonel Jack. 3 novels all in 1 year. And each of these novels are about 200, 300 pages long. And then finally Roxana was his last one. So you can see that, he's like what is he? What is he, 59 when he writes this thing? Yeah, so yeah, that's about 59 when he writes. So if you're ever thinking, like I do mostly, like when am I going to write my great big novel? And all through my life of like, oh, well, I've now passed that guy. I still haven't passed Defoe. I still have a few more years to get to writing my great novel. So here's something else just about novels that I want to show you that is kind of cool. And this is another example of how a lot of what he was doing is so similar to like what we are like today. So here is like the title page of the original publication of Robinson Crusoe, The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York Mariner, who lived 8 and 20 years all alone on an uninhabited island on the coast of America near the mouth of the great river Orinoco, having been called on shore, or having been cast, you see that thing that looks like an F every once in a while, that's actually called the swash, or swash. It's a long ass. Sometimes I get confused. So having been cast on shore by shipwreck, wherein all men perished but himself, with an account of how he was last as strangely delivered by pirates, written by himself, okay? Moll Flanders is my favorite title page of all time. The fortunes and misfortunes of the famous Moll Flanders, who was born in Newgate, that's a prison, and her mother was in prison at the time. And during a life of continued variety for 80 years, besides her childhood, was 12 years a whore, 5 times a wife, whereof once to her own brother, 12 years a thief, 8 years transported felon in Virginia, and last grew rich, lived honest, and died a penitent. Written from her own memorandums. So, and then the last one there is Journal of the Plague Year, being observations or memorials on the most remarkable occurrences, as well public as private, which happened in London during the last great visitation in 1665, written by a citizen who continued all the while in London, never made public before. So you can see reality TV type influence, you can see that we still have this kind of stuff with like tabloid magazines, reality TV. Of course, Robinson Crusoe did not write Robinson Crusoe. Daniel Defoe wrote it. Written by a citizen who continued all the while in London. That's a complete lie. It was Daniel Defoe who wrote it, okay? But this was a common thing. And, this looked a lot like non-fictional journals at the time. During this time period, a lot of like spiritual journals were being published, like, explorers, captains would go on explorations and come home and publish their journals. So Defoe is very much imitating the non-fiction that was out at this time. So let's talk about like Journal of the Plague Year. It's narrated by a guy named H.F. We don't know his first name, we don't know his last name. A lot of people believe that it's a reference to Defoe's uncle, Henry Foe. So the Foe is where Daniel, they were called Foes, and then at some point Daniel Defoe changed his name to Defoe, okay? Although there's still every once in a while references to him, like in historical documents calling him Daniel Foe. So this guy in the book was a saddler, so that meant he made saddles for horses, meaning these saddles were shipped to America at the time. And this narrator provides a lot of vivid details throughout the book. He has this kind of, it's just, by the way, there are no chapters in any Daniel Defoe book. It's just, it just never stops, okay? There's no break. And so like, it's just paragraph after paragraph. And what he does is he kind of just goes from one thing to another. So sometimes he's summarizing what he's heard. Like, again, as the character HF. It's like the other day I heard someone talking about this down the road. Or, when I went down the road. And so he gets information about the plague that way. A lot of times he'll describe a meeting he had with someone like in the street. And he also makes use of like historical documents, like recording what's on the bills that were posted to see how many people died and all that. And he has like some government documents in there that like, now that this is unavailable, like now that this plague has started, here's what we're going to start doing in terms of, making sure we have watchmen and examiners and physicians, everyone's responsibility. He'll just take like that 5 pages of a government document and just put it right into his book. So, he is a religious narrator. He is constantly thanking God for various things, thanking God for like sparing his life during this plague. But he also mentions the Bible throughout, like he's making constant references to like things Jesus said or Psalms or like books from Lamentations and all that kind of stuff. Daniel Defoe is a very religious person as well. And he is conflicted a lot of times and inconsistent. And some of this could be because Daniel Defoe is writing it so quickly that he doesn't realize that his own narrator is contradicting himself. But actually, it kind of lends a certain amount of realism to the whole thing and makes him seem like a real character because he's constantly kind of debating with himself. He'll say one thing on one page and then 10 pages later he'll say another thing. And a good example of this is at the very beginning of the book when he decides what to do. So when this plague is coming, and this is a similarity we had with COVID, right? What are you going to do? The rich people, what do? They stay in the city of London? Not a lot of them. They're out. They immediately take off and go out to the country or something like that so they don't have to stay with us. And so he starts talking here. And when I came to discourse with my brother again, I told him that I inclined to stay and take my lot in that station in which God had placed me, and that it seemed to be more especially my duty on account of what I said. So I'm telling my brother, I'm staying here in London. Because he was worried about his business. He was worried that like what would happen to his business. And he had like employees and stuff like that. My brother, though a very religious man himself, laughed at all I had suggested about it being an intimation from heaven and told me several stories of such foolhardy people, and goes on. So after his brother said, you're a fool for doing this, Then he goes, upon these arguments, my brother changed my resolution again, and I began to resolve to go, and accordingly made all things ready. So his brother had one conversation with him and said, this is what's going to happen to you if you stay. And he's like, okay, yeah, I guess I'll go. And then a page later, I scarce need tell the reader that from the moment I resolved that I would stay in town and casting myself entirely upon the goodness and the protection of the Almighty, would not seek any shelter whatsoever. So I decided, I am here, I'm staying, I'm going to put my trust in God. And then at the very end, now I began to faint in my resolutions, and my heart failed me very much, and sorely I repented of my rashness when I had been out, and met with such terrible things as these I have talked of. I wished often that I had not taken upon me to stay, but had gone away with my brother and his family. So like later in the book, he regrets his decision, but then sometimes he's very glad he stayed, in it. So the power of the book comes from the writing. He's very descriptive. And here we have some descriptions of the way people acted. Sorrow and sadness sat upon every face, and though some part were not yet overwhelmed, yet all looked deeply concerned, and we saw it apparently going on. So everyone looked on himself and his family as in the utmost danger. This is at the beginning of the plague. Maybe you saw this when you went to the grocery store, after things were shutting down, the nervousness of like what's going to come in the month of March or something like that. London might well be said to be all in tears. The mourners did not go about the streets indeed, for nobody put on black or made formal dress of mourning for their nearest friends. But the voice of mourning was truly heard in the streets, the shrieks of women and children at the windows and the doors of their houses, where their dearest relations were perhaps dying or just dead. It was indeed a lamentable thing to hear the miserable lamentations of the poor, dying creatures calling out for ministers to comfort them and pray with them. I wish I could repeat the very sound of these groans and those exclamations that I heard from some poor dying creatures when in the height of their agonies and distress, and that I could make them that read this hear, as I imagine I now hear them, for the sound seems to still ring in my ears. So over and over again, I have like sentences and paragraphs like this where there's just an oppressive state of sadness going on during this pandemic as people are walking the streets crying because so many people, their families have died, people they know, and they're afraid of themselves dying. And there are times where the description it's like The Walking Dead, where there are people who are so sick that they come out of their house and they're struggling down the street because they've lost sense. He repeats that over and over again. Somebody's come out, they've got such a high fever, they can't make sense. There's images of like people throwing themselves into the burial pits because they can't take the pain anymore, so they just give up, okay? And a very troubling thing, which is very, very much out of The Walking Dead, like a man comes up completely infected, grabs onto a young woman and kisses her, and then the young woman dies within a couple hours, but not necessarily, Defoe says, not necessarily because of the plague, but because of the fright, the fear. So a lot of people are dying of like fear, he says, and things like that. So it's just not a very good world to be in at this time. The style of this is that, like a lot of times what he does is he focuses on a character or subject for a few pages. He doesn't really sustain anything for very long. The most sustained episode in the entire book is a kind of an odd thing because it doesn't even take place in the city. For 20 pages, he follows these three men who are seeking to find shelter outside of London. They wait too long to leave, and then they leave, and they keep going to nearby towns, and all the towns are like, stay away, do not come near us, we do not want the plague. And so it's these three men trying to like find a place to stay outside the city. That goes on for 20 pages. But most of the things are just like done in a page or two. So here's an example of like how quickly he moves from topic to topic, and just 2 pages here. So this starts off with he gets a visit from his friend, Dr. Heath, who gives him advice on how you should shut yourself up in your house. This then leads to a lengthy description of HF's, the narrator's, like provisions that he has. So he talks about how much, stuff he's got to make bread. He talks about how he's got all the ingredients to make beer, and I think he's got about 5 weeks worth of beer, he says, in there. And he's got cheese and all that, which then leads him to say that, like, I didn't have any meat, which then gets him off on another topic all about how dangerous the meat is right now, because everyone thinks the meat at butchers is tainted, and they're afraid if they eat the meat, they're going to get the plague. And this is a great example of how things do not change. So the butchers, because they didn't want to get sick, forced people to go get the meat off the hooks themselves. They didn't want to touch it anymore. Remember, back again, like think back a couple years ago when you went to the grocery, like all of a sudden, like touchless. We're not touching anything anymore, And so like the money, they had a pot of vinegar, and that's how you would pay the butcher. You would throw your coins in this pot of vinegar so that it was sanitized, okay? Again, just an example of how some things never change. The whole touchless pay system that we got into is very similar. The poor, once he talks about all the supplies he had, he then moves on and talks about how the poor don't have much of their own. They can't afford to lay up provisions like he did, so they have to still go out and buy stuff. That gets him talking again about people going to the market and talking about how some people would just fall down dead in the middle of the marketplace because they didn't realize they were sick. And then other people, he talks about how you see corpses lying in the street. And when it first started happening, you would tell the neighbor, there's a corpse here outside your door, you may want to know about it. But then after some time, you just went to the other side of the street, you didn't worry about it anymore, okay? All right, so the control of the plague, he spends a lot of time talking about that. You have burial pits and dead carts. These are you had so many people dying, they couldn't bury people individually, so you had these huge mass graves. You had watchmen and people locking in their homes. Oh, so the burial pits, the way that would work, so you'd have the dead carts. So the dead carts would come around the evenings. You'd hear a bell ring, and that was a signal that the dead cart was coming. And if there was somebody dead in your house, you were supposed to bring them downstairs, put them by the front door, and the dead cart would pull them away. They tried to do this at night so that you wouldn't have dead bodies laying in the street. This is kind of another contradiction, like you see, at one point in the book, he talks about dead people laying in the street. But then later on in the book, he talks about how good the government was of removing the dead so that during the daytime, there was no dead people in the street. So he kind of had it both ways. I think there were times where they couldn't keep up with the number of dead. So you had these watchmen, and every house that was infected had 2 watchmen. So they painted X on the door, like you cannot leave. They would seal up that place, and they had a watchman during the day and a watchman during the night. And they would be responsible for making sure nobody came out of that home. And hoping that because if they came out of that home and they went in the streets, they would infect other people. And you also had pest houses where you would have people go, they didn't have too many of these. Daniel Defoe keeps arguing as the narrator, but it's really Daniel Defoe, writing his idea. He didn't like the locking people up in their home. He thought that was a bad deal because basically that meant once you locked one person up, your whole family was going to die, okay? He much preferred the pest houses. Like if we could just get the sick person to the pest house, they would probably die, but the rest of the family would be okay. But on the other hand, he then contradicts himself again later, saying that would mean a lot of people wandering the streets and that kind of stuff. But people would lie. The examiner would come, and they were so afraid of being locked up, they'd be like, "Has anyone here had the plague?" And they'd be, "No," and people would have the plague. Okay. So smokes and fires, they were burning smoke around. They thought that would do something. So people were encouraged to keep their fireplaces burning in the summer, all that kind of stuff. They destroyed all the dogs and cats because they thought they were carriers of the disease. I was reading somewhere that that destroying of the cats may have actually made the plague go longer since cats ate the rats and stuff like that. And then the best solution, according to our narrator, HF, was that people should just leave. Okay, that would be the best thing that would have ever happened. And there are indications, again, he's writing this thinking of the future, okay, there's of this plague coming again. So he's kind of giving hints when this thing hits again, maybe that's what we should all do is leave. And, of course, again, he didn't leave himself, but that was his solution, is to basically make the population of London smaller. So here you have the worst of humanity coming out at times. There's a lot of stories of hope and everything like that too, which we'll get to right at the end. But you have people taking advantage of fear, a lot of fake medicines and cures that came out at the beginning. People would charge money, and of course they didn't cure the person at all. The person still died. There were astrologers that would try to predict the future. 3 Men in the Tavern is the most depressing one of these things, where he tells the story of a dead cart taking a bunch of people to be thrown into the pit, And there's a man that's following them, like, why are you following this cart? And he's like, my wife and children, my whole family is on that cart. I just want to see them buried one last time. And so they throw them in there, and he's so distraught, he's crying profusely. They take him to a tavern where he's like, gets comforted by people, but there's these 3 young guys there that have spent the last few days making fun of everybody who's died. They sit there by the window, and when the death cart comes by, they shout out insults and stuff like that, and people who are mourning, they're so mean and nasty, and HF confronts these guys, like, why are you doing that? And like, maybe you should just jump in, they tell people, people that are mourning, like, if you love those people so much, why don't you jump in the death pit with them? They were saying things like that to people. They got their comeuppances within a week of all this happening. They all got the plague and died too, the 3 men. You have people, I already mentioned that, they'd try to escape quarantine by lying about being sick. They would sneak out of their house. They would tell like the watchman, like, hey, we need some food. Go get the food for us. Here's some money. And they'd go get the food. And while the watchman was gone, they'd leave. Or like one person would die in the house and they'd sneak out the back. They'd like jump out the window or something. And then you have nurses that were hired that actually would murder the people with the plague sometimes. They could see that they were dying. So instead of waiting for them to die, they would just go ahead and murder them ahead of time. And then my favorite story is the plague piper. And this is one that was like kind of like folklore at the time. It was well known before he even wrote the book. So it's kind of a humorous little story. So the piper was this basically homeless individual that would play his bagpipes, and he would do that in the evening, and then people would like give him some money, but a lot of times they just take him to like the local tavern and give him some food and give him some drink and let him be on his way. And one night he drank a little too much. After playing his pipes, he went back and laid down outside of someone's door. The bell rings, the death cart comes down, they put a dead guy right next to him. This guy's completely drunk out of his mind, the plague piper. He gets thrown into the death cart with all the dead bodies, okay? And let me pick this up real quickly. So this guy running the dead cart, his name is John Hayward. So they come to the grave. So John Hayward says, here we go. So just as they were ready to dump out, the piper wakes up and says, hey, where am I? This frightened the fellow that was telling him about the work. So anyway, he scared the crap out of everyone around the cart that was going to dump the dead bodies. So suddenly one of the bodies gets up. Okay, and then he says, John Hayward, recovering himself, the guy that was driving the cart, said, Lord bless us, there's some body in this cart not quite dead. So another called to him and said, who are you? And the fellow answered, I am the poor piper. Where am I? And then John Hayward goes, where are you? Well, you're in the dead cart. And we were going to bury you. And then the plague piper says, but I ain't dead though, am I? And then that made everyone laugh a little. And they were horribly frightened at first, but he got off and went on his business, got out of the cart and like, I'm done with this. So those are little, amusing little stories. One thing that comes up over and over again throughout this is the poor. Daniel Defoe in his non-fictional writing was very concerned with the situation of the poor. That was one of his topics. And this is no exception. HF, the narrator, is continually emphasizing the plight of the poor. Again, we see similarities here. They couldn't leave. They were in terrible housing conditions. We think back to like when, back in March and April, when the first, all those people like in New York City, so many of those people got sick because there were like, 5, 6 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment. And we're seeing that here. When the businesses shut down, they lost their jobs. They couldn't afford a nurse or a physician to attend them as they suffered. And they did, when they got bright spots, is he did say that charity increased for the poor at the end of the book. He did say that like people were that could afford to gave them charity. These are, again, contradictory attitudes. It must be confessed that the plague was chiefly among the poor, yet were the poor the most venturous and fearless of it, and went about their employment with a sort of brutal courage, run into any business where they could get employment, though it was most hazardous, such as the tending of the sick, watching the houses shutting up, or carrying away infected persons to the pest house, and which was still worse, carrying the dead away to their graves. So that he kind of like has this respect for them. But then, 100 pages later, but it was impossible to beat anything into the heads of the poor. They went on with the usual impetuosity of their tempers, full of outcries and lamentations when taken, but madly careless of themselves, foolhardy and obstinate. While they were well where they could get employment, they pushed into any kind of business, the most dangerous and the most liable to infection. And if they were spoken to, their answer would be, I must trust God for that. So on the one hand, he respects them in the first quotation, but then later he's frustrated with them because they're not taking care of themselves. So at the end of the plague, the numbers start to drop in September. And by the beginning of October, they're falling significantly. Again, here's a similarity between us and this time and last summer. This line here, people start returning to the city and the businesses open up again. The change in behavior happens too soon, and this impudent, rash conduct cost a great many of their lives who had a great care and caution shut themselves up and had by that means, under God's providence, been preserved through all the heat of infection. So you had all these people that survived the plague and then suddenly went out like as if nothing had happened and got sick and died like in the last days of the plague. This is like, remember last summer when the vaccines came out and all of a sudden the restaurants opened all up again. We're like, we're over. And the Delta came, okay? Same thing going on here. And then in the middle of the distress, when the condition of the city of London was truly calamitous, just when it pleased God, as it were, by his immediate hand to disarm this enemy, the poison was taken out of the sting. It was wonderful. Even the physicians themselves were surprised at it. The plague is over. It just ends. Some people like to say 1665 was the plague, and then 1666 the London fire burned it away. There's really no connection between that, because there are plenty of places where the plague went away where there wasn't a fire, like some of the outlying towns and stuff like that. So HF just believes it was God's hand that did it. It's probably just that the plague had run its course. Enough people got infected that it just stopped. So here's how he ends his book with this poem. A dreadful plague in London was in the year 65, which swept 100,000 souls away, yet I alive. And so he survived it. And there's in the original book, there's the phoenix, like the phoenix rising, the bird, and that's at the end, underneath this little poem he writes. So that's it. Any questions that you guys have at all?
Yes. So just some basic stuff. I mean, when was it discovered the rats were the carrier of the flea?
Oh yeah. So the question is, when was it discovered that the rats were the ones that were carrying the disease and stuff like that? Not at the time. Okay. I mean, because a lot of people thought it was just something in the air that was causing this. So they didn't know if it was airborne. They knew that definitely close proximity caused it. Okay. But it wasn't until much later that they realized that the bubonic plague had this connection with that flea. Okay, I think a lot of people thought it was just people talking to one another, not realizing that the fleas were bouncing off of each other. So yeah, if you read this book, you will not get an answer as to why this is happening.
So another question. The book is largely, in my mind, confined to English departments, but it seems like, given what you've talked about today, is there any sense among people who are in urban planning or in healthcare that this book ought to be studied much more carefully than it might be?
So the question is about whether or not this book is ever studied outside English departments, like with urban planning or health medicine. I haven't seen anything about urban planning. I have seen scholarly articles written by scientists and physicians, and again, during the AIDS epidemic, a lot of stuff was written that using this book, at least in terms of the way people were so afraid of the plague, similar, and they didn't know what was going on, same way to the early start of the AIDS epidemic. These people were ostracized because they had AIDS and we didn't know what was causing it completely and that kind of thing, So some scientists and physicians have used this book.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay.
We have one more question online here. Michael asked, does Defoe's book owe anything to Samuel's diary?
No. I mean, I shouldn't say no, but it's possible. He's pulling from so many sources. I don't know if Pepys's diary was something that Defoe would have been aware of at the time. I didn't see any reference to that. I know that Pepys actually describes the plague very differently than Defoe. He doesn't have quite the grim view that Defoe has. Samuel Pepys was an eyewitness, and we have his diary, so that's like eyewitness accounts. Defoe's is like a combination like fiction, stories he's heard, stories his uncle told him probably, because his uncle did live through the plague, but not that I'm aware of. Yes.
If they thought the plague was airborne, would they might have worn maybe like a scarf around their face?
No, there wasn't. There's nothing in there like that at all. The precautions are basically like filling your house full of smoke. They thought that would have more of an effect, in ridding it and stuff like that. But no, you don't get any picture of like anybody walking around. They were very afraid of clothes. A ship would pull in and they'd have they thought the clothes were infected. They made sure to burn. There was a lot of burning of clothes. Like when someone dies, they burn the clothes. So they thought, so they're getting close, you see, about where it was coming from. But no, there's no record of people wearing masks and stuff. Although they did have the plague mask, and stuff like that when doctors would go visit and stuff. But anything else? Okay, great. Is that all? Thank you very much.